Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Jihan Chobanolu. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending upon where you are connected to this webinar. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Association of North America Higher Education International's Distinguished Lecture Series. Today we have Professor Ilan Alon with us, all the way from Norway. And for us, it's a little bit special time. I'm in Florida right now because we just survived Hurricane Irma. Some of you, I'm sure you already follow from the media. Thanks God that we are all good here. Without further ado, I would like to go ahead and get started with our webinar. So first, I'm going to share my screen with you. So I do hope that you see the presentation there. So okay, can you, I'm just going to go a quick housekeeping. For those of you who are joining, you should be seeing the screen housekeeping on your screen. If you do see that, please click on the raise hand so that we know that our voice go to you nice and easy. Again, there's you should see this control panel here. And if you do see, if you hear us, please click on raise hand. This is going to indicate to us that you are seeing, oh, I see, perfect. That's great. A lot of people raise hand. I appreciate it. Thank you. This means that our voice is coming to you successfully. Also, I would like to ask you for those of you who have any questions throughout the webinar, after Professor Alon has finished, he's going to take the questions, but you can add your questions into either what you see here, Q&A, right here on the screen, or you can click on the chat button. Both of them are going to be okay, and I will read them to him at the end of his presentation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the Association of North America Higher Education International. The mission of ANAHEI is as a non-profit organization is to promote and encourage a global culture at member institutions, globalize student and faculty successes, enhance global initiatives among member institutions, and deepen global engagement. What we do here is this distinguished lecture series is one of the services that ANAHEI is doing it. My name is Professor Jihan Chobanolu. I'm the president of ANAHEI. I also serve as the McKibben Endowed Chair Professor and also director of M3 Center at the University of South Florida, Sarasota, Manatee. I also edit several journals, among all the other things that I do. My contact information is on the screen. ANAHEI offers many different programs, all of which that you can visit at anahei.org as the website. Visiting Scholars Program, partnership programs. We have 2 open access journals, 5 conferences, several awards, and of course, what we do today is the Distinguished Lecture Series. This series and the one that we are doing, we have done before, they are all recorded and you can see them at the website, anahei.org. Please go and be a member if you are not already. It's a free membership. This particular lecture and all the previous lectures are going to be found after it is finished in this address, anahei.org/lecture. And I would like to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Ilan Alon, as you can see here on the screen, and he is going to talk today. His speech is going to be China Goes Global, Present Theory and Future Directions. I would like to introduce him to you. Dr. Ilan Alon is a professor of strategy and international marketing at the University of Agder, Norway, and which is where he's joining us today right now. It's about 5 p.m. there, and visiting scholar at Georgetown University, USA. Prior to this, Dr. Alon was also a visiting scholar at Harvard University. Alon's teaching consulting work spans the globe, covering America, Europe, Asia, and Middle East. He has taught in top business programs globally, including Shanghai Jiao Tong University, Emilion, Ben Gurion University, Bill Kent University, and MIB, among others. Professor Alon's research includes global franchising, political risk assessment, and the globalization of Chinese enterprises. He authored numerous peer-reviewed articles, including one appearing in Journal of International Marketing, Harvard Business Review, and Corporate Governance, an international review, and books such as Global Marketing, Global Franchising Operations Management, Cases in International and Emerging Market Operations, Franchising Globally, Innovation, Learning, and Imitation, Service Franchising, A Global Perspective, Chinese International Investments, Chinese Entrepreneurs, China Rules, Globalization of Chinese Enterprises, among other books. As you can see, he is very qualified to talk about this particular topic. I am myself very excited because I have a lot of interest in China personally. Without further ado, I'm going to let the floor to him, but we have quick polls. Dr. Alon wanted us to check with the attendees. I'm going to show them to you one at a time, very simple, and then we are going to go sends the results to you. You should see, hopefully, in your screen, there are some questions. Have you visited China? Yes or no. Have you worked in China? Yes or no. Or have you conducted any research regarding China? Yes or no. Simple questions. And I see that many of you already have voted. And this is going to give Professor Alon an idea about the audience here. I'm going to give another 5 to 7 seconds. Perfect. I'm going to end the poll and then share the results with you. About 50% of our audience visited China. 38% have worked in China, which is great. And 38% of them also conducted research regarding China, which is wonderful. Professor Alon, I'm going to stop the polling and I will give the floor to you. Thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, and thanks for arranging it, Jihan. I have already shared my screen, have I not? Can you see it?
Not yet. Please share your screen again.
Okay, and we'll do it again.
And
here we go. Can you see it now?
Yeah, we can see it now. Perfect.
Wonderful. So I've been doing research on China for some 20 years now. And during these 2 decades, I've had a chance to publish a number of books and articles, some of which you mentioned, and many of which are focused on both China, Chinese entrepreneurs, Chinese institutions, and perhaps more specifically, the globalization of China. And what I hope to do today is to share with you some of the observations and some of the lessons that I've taken away from both researching China, but secondly, from the about 12 years or so that we've been running an annual conference under China Goes Global, which is part of the Chinese Globalization Association. And in the first 6 years of our life, we were holding the conference at the Harvard Kennedy School. And since then, we ourselves have gone global and have taken this conference to different countries. The last year was in Norway, and next year will be in June in Shanghai, China. For those of you who have an interest and passion for Chinese research, you might enjoy attending and presenting and reviewing for this particular conference. So why study Chinese FDI or the globalization of Chinese capital? Well, I think first and foremost, you have to remember that China, despite being new to this game of Chinese investments abroad, it's actually become the world's largest investor. It's now number 2, oscillates between number 2 and number 3 from year to year. And again, despite its growth, it's still a relatively small number as it compares to the Chinese economy as a whole. So while we have large outflows of capital, the overall Chinese investment position is still relatively small as compared to the Chinese GDP. So we were expecting that Chinese growth in foreign direct investment is going to grow exponentially in the next decade. And part of this reason is that the starting point is small or low. But the other reason is that the government has made a purposeful action and policy to promote global investment. And furthermore, Chinese companies themselves are finding the benefits and developing the skills to do that. And for those of us who are researchers of franchising, researchers of international investment in China, you probably have seen the growth of the articles in this field, and you've also seen that perhaps this is an opportunity for us to test international theories, international investment theories, as this new China data provides more information and shows that Chinese investors actually follow a slightly different pattern than the one followed by their Western counterparts. So if we start by looking at Chinese outward foreign direct investment flows and positions, you could see two very interesting things. Number one, it's growing very fast, but number two, that many of the destinations of Chinese investment are in fact offshore financial centers. Oftentimes, Hong Kong, despite being the majority of the investment destination, it is in fact only a passage to Chinese investment to go elsewhere. The same could be said about the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and even Luxembourg and the Netherlands. So we find it hard to really fully understand Chinese investment when we look at both the flows and the position, because oftentimes the final destination of the investment is unknown. Nevertheless, Chinese investment has already surpassed most countries in the world, and Chinese mainland investment is second only to the US. And when you add to this Hong Kong, as you could see, and when you add to this also some of the other financial offshore centers, then you could see that in fact this MOFCOM figure probably greatly underestimates the true nature of these foreign financial flows. So we could see that despite the growth, the actual investment is actually quite higher. And if we want to project it a little bit into the future, let's say 2020, at least by one estimate, the overall investment position will reach $18 trillion by the year 2020. So there is both a practical and a theoretical reason to better understand why Chinese are going global and how they might be doing that. So the first question you might ask yourself, well, why is it that this investment is increasing so fast, exponentially, and recently? Well, part of the reason is that up till, let's say, the year 2000 or so, much of the policy was focused on inward investment. And in fact, various capital controls were in place to prevent outward foreign direct investment. For example, through the very complicated procedures of approving foreign investment and through capital controls. We believe that the capital controls will be eased as we move forward. Well, why is it that the Chinese have made this policy change? Why is it that they decided that they want to start investing abroad? Well, several reasons exist for it, but the general consensus is that the Chinese want to avoid the middle income trap. They want to make sure that they can continue to grow and become the largest and most powerful economy of the world. And if we use this basic graph, you could see that China has been the manufacturing hub of the world. But this, despite having this huge impact on world production, in fact, the profitability of many of these Chinese manufacturers was very low. despite being the OEM of the world, much of the profits are actually at either the innovative base or in the branding. So the investments of Chinese right now all over the world are both upstream and downstream towards the consumer. And those are to both to gain better competitiveness for their firms through R&D and knowledge, and to get a better understanding of the consumers and the markets that are out there. So what I'm going to do today is I would like to summarize some of the research and the theories proposed by many of the keynoters of China Goes Global, and probably the biggest names and the most influential researchers on the emerging market multinationals, and particularly Chinese emerging market multinationals. So I will go through some of these big author names, and you can see and learn more about what they have said and what approach they have taken. So starting with Ravi Ramamarty, he has made I think, a singular contribution to our understanding of emerging market multinationals beyond China. But specific to China, he asked the vexing questions of how is it that Chinese internationalize in such a unique way? At least from our Western experience, we have always believed that internationalization follows certain stages. From the Uppsala model, for example, we have learned that companies wanting to go global start by approaching countries that are close to them physically and culturally, and they usually start with exporting before deciding to invest more resources. And therefore, there is an incremental process of globalization. Now, when you look at Chinese investment abroad, it seems to be rather abrupt, very fast, with too much equity, and to countries that seem to be perhaps institutionally different, culturally different, and economically different. So there is a need to understand why is it that the internationalization pattern has really, in fact, taken a different direction. Well, Ravi has actually offered a number of answers to this question. And those include both external environmental explanations and internal environment explanations. On the external front, one can argue that the global context of internationalization is very different today. Unlike the Asian tigers, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, and others, these companies in China don't have 20 years to internationalize. They need to go fast, and they need to learn fast. It is as though they were playing Monopoly with the other companies and countries around the world that are only starting now. As late internationalizers, many of the prime property is already taken. Chinese investment is oftentimes in mature industries. For example, the oil industry and the resources industry, and those industry consolidation is needed, and therefore the patterns are a bit different. And of course, the assumption is that in many of our international investment theories, that these companies come out of countries that are strong politically and institutionally and have some competitive advantage in those countries. But the reality is that, in fact, many of them are going abroad to leverage the home country advantage, that is the cheap market on the one hand and the large market on the other. So many of these firms, in fact, are going out to overcome domestic institutions by investing, let's say, in R&D in Europe and America, and in order to overcome the difficulties of various transactions that might be more difficult in the Chinese context. That's how many of them have ended up in offshore financial centers, for example. On the internal environment, the stage of evolution of Chinese multinationals is very early. So they're going to make many of the mistakes that other multinationals have made in other countries when they first started going global, including Europe and the United States in the 20th century. So the assumption that they're going out of strength because they're quite good domestically should be replaced with the reality that, in fact, many of them go out in order to buy the strengths You could think about Geely and Lenovo buying Volvo and IBM PC divisions in order to develop those divisions in their own companies and make sure that they are world standard. And then the other thing is that China now is developing new business models. This very lecture now is going to be broadcasted through WeChat, which is a Chinese company making waves and developing business models that integrate both the WhatsApp and the Facebook and the Twitter capabilities simultaneously, and therefore creating new opportunities for new business models, both domestically and abroad. Marshall Meyer of Wharton Business School, he suggested that many Chinese firms go global not because they don't want to go to sell in other domestic areas within China, but because the transaction costs of going from one province to another oftentimes exceed the transaction costs of going from one province overseas. So for a Shanghai business, it might be easier to transact in California than it is, let's say, in Jilin or other cities, even Beijing. So, of course, the graph that shows the relationship between spatial distance and transaction costs has flattened as a result of information and communication technologies. But nevertheless, you could argue that these protectionism at the local level, at the provincial level, has actually pushed companies to go global before going domestic. One of my first books on the globalization of Chinese enterprises, edited from one of our conferences, was published by Palgrave, and in it there was a number of excellent articles and chapters focused on why firms in China globalize, and the two kind of distinct theories that came through across the various chapters were resource-based theory and institutional theory. The resource-based really focusing on the firm level resources, and the institutional theory on the context of the host and home market. I was honored to see that when Alan Rugman reviewed the book, he actually had a chance to publish his review. But I was a bit disappointed when he wrote that in contrast, if you see on the bottom, the opening chapters by Alon concludes the traditional Western theories of international business need to be adapted to the Chinese context, or new theories altogether are necessary, as several chapters in the book indeed appear to demonstrate. The traditional theories of business, traditional international business theories are inadequate. I shall focus upon this incorrect assessment of the literature. What Alan Rugman has suggested is, in fact, we could use the existing theories, but this debate over whether we need new theories or use the existing theories or modify existing theories for the Chinese context is still ongoing, and we'll touch base when we talk about research, future research. I'll touch base on this point. But what Alan Rugman has suggested in his review is probably the best theory, is one of his own, invented a long time ago, and focused on a 2x2 matrix, which divides firm-specific and country-specific advantages, and suggests that companies coming out of China, for example, are coming from countries that are very strong, but the companies themselves are very weak and therefore belong in box number 1. In contrast, companies coming out of India are coming from countries that are relatively weak, but have very strong firm-specific advantages, therefore belonging to cell number 4. And what Rugman suggested is that depending on the cell that you come from, the internationalization strategy and your competitiveness will vary. Building on this framework, several researchers have actually deconstructed both the firm-specific and the country-specific advantages, starting with Rabbi Ramu Marti. He suggested that, in fact, the country-specific advantages divide between those basic Heschker Olin type factors like land and labor and natural resources, climate and location, and government-specific advantages. Those include policies of government that help promote internationalization, including infrastructure, human capital, business climate, and industrial policies. And what he suggested is that countries like China, as compared to India, might have much stronger government-specific advantages rather than the basic endowments of factors like labor and capital. Going further down the deconstruction of the environment, John Child, in fact Child and Marinova, have published another 2x2 framework which divides the country's environment into political and institutional maturity. So China belongs into quadrant B, in which in the political stability might be high, but that institutional maturity for business is low. The United States might have high political stability and institutional maturity. And the argument goes that when you are a home country firm coming from one quadrant and going to a host country that belongs in another quadrant, the institutional distance will prevent companies from being successful in other territories. Simon Collinson has actually focused on the firm-specific advantages and divided them into resource-seeking and market-seeking firms, and on the other hand, looked at the assets, capabilities, connections, and reputation. His research clearly shows that, in fact, if we look at most Chinese firms today, or if we looked at these very same firms 10 years ago, both resource-seeking and market-seeking seem to be weak on most of these firm-specific resources and firm-specific advantages that Simon Collinson has identified. Going further, Yadung Law tried to classify firms into different categories, state-owned and non-state-owned, based on ownership and based on organization, whether they are diverse or focused companies. Well, it turns out that the motivations to go global, the impacts of going global, might be determined by whether the firm is state-owned or not state-owned. For example, the acceptability of the foreign firm in the host market, particularly when sensitive industries are involved, and might be affected by the level of diversification of the firm. This basically leads to 4 different types of firms. And if we look at most of the large investments abroad today, many of them are in fact in the state-owned sector, and many of them are both diversified and undiversified and can be seen as agents of the Chinese government, or at the very least commissioned specialists, which might give them a hard time when investing in sensitive industries or when investing in developed countries. Jean-Francois Hennard has attempted to develop a new theory of emerging market multinationals. And in this theory, he took an aim at the OLI framework, the ownership, location, internalization framework that has helped to explain much of the foreign direct investment from the West. He basically criticized the point that most of these studies have assumed that the location-specific factors are in fact freely available to anyone, and that the technology is owned by the multinational firm. In order to understand why Chinese firms are buying foreign firms versus the other way around, he made a better model that relaxed the assumption that location-specific advantages are in fact freely available. And if you see that, you can see that many of the Chinese firms have location-specific advantages and are able to leverage those advantages in order to buy foreign firms, foreign technologies, which might even have more substitutes and might be freely available in the global market for goods and ideas. And if we look at the traditional approaches to understanding the motivations to invest abroad, Dunning and London work has been seminal and has informed many research papers. Those include natural resources, market seeking, and efficiency seeking, and strategic seeking investments. When you asked Chinese firms what is really driving your investment abroad, as we have done in 2014 when we asked the largest state-owned enterprises in China to let us know that? Actually, we found something very interesting. The number one reason was business potential. That is market-seeking investments. And the importance of this particular country as a market, or whether they have natural resources, whether the government has assisted them, whether they have transparent and fair regulatory system, whether they have a good tax system. But what I think you should notice is that very few firms from China, state-owned enterprises, wanted a system that is high in political risks or low in protection of intellectual property, or is problematic with respect to transparency, fairness, or corruption. In fact, many of the motivations are similar to the motivations that we see in firms from Western countries, perhaps with the exception that government has played an important role in China in inducing and encouraging Chinese firms to go global. And the other thing is that the idea that institutional distance, right, that Chinese will more likely invest in countries with bad governance or with corruption or that have cheap labor. In fact, we could see that that is not the reason that the firms from China want to invest abroad. So I want to, after summarizing the kind of the key researchers and theories from the keynoters of China Goes Global, I thought that I would leave you with maybe 5 vexing research questions that you might want to explore as you're thinking about the globalization of Chinese enterprises. Number 1 are the boundary conditions for the theoretical adaptation. This goes back to the review of Alan Rugman, but that essentially gives researchers a large field of opportunities to test Western-based theories. Number 2, data problems leading to nonsensical results. Number 3, the possibility that we have non-linear or non-Western relations in the data. And number 4, that operational difficulties and dynamic capabilities will change the way Chinese firms approach international markets. And the final point, and I think many policymakers are particularly concerned about, is China a strategic threat or is China a strategic opportunity? So on the first point, myself, John Child, and Xiaomin Li have published an article in Management and Organization Review in which we tried to see if, in fact, China is different. If you ask most China scholars or the Chinese themselves, they often say, well, China is different and therefore doesn't fit into the frameworks developed in the West. Well, that's not always, in fact, true. China is different in many ways, but some of those differences are systematic and might be able to be generalized. When can we use the Western theories? When can we do the theoretical borrowing? Oftentimes, that's when institutions don't matter or government influence is not relevant or the culture is not relevant. But when those things are relevant and when the phenomena might be indigenous phenomena, then either new theories are needed or the existing theories need to be modified. My own research on China, on different aspects of China, I found that Chinese firm motivations are oftentimes very similar. But on the other hand, that corporate governance, local institutional forces, and CSR are very different and require different approaches. Dylan Sutherland and John Anderson, also known as Andy, had published just a wonderful paper on the pitfalls of using investment data on China in the China Quarterly. And in that paper, they have shown very clearly that the inclusion of financial offshore financial centers, in fact, distorts data so much that the data and the results are just a fiction of the statistics. In a sense, garbage in, garbage out for many of these papers. For example, when we looked at many of the research papers looking at the relationship between political risk and Chinese investment using MOFCOM data, or using commercial data, we found very different results. And the results are biased because the data is biased, and therefore drawing conclusions on the relationship between political risk and investment, as many papers have, shown that political risk actually incentivizes Chinese investors, might be, I think, erroneous, and the conclusion might be dangerous. On the other hand, we might also see that there are some nonlinear relationships in the data. For example, we found that when we looked at economic freedom, we found a very curvilinear relationship in Chinese OFDI data. So on the left side, you might see North Korea and Venezuela and Colombia and Angola, and those would be friendly regimes to the Chinese regime, as opposed to the right side, which has the large developed countries, which also are friendly to Chinese investment. So might be an interesting approach to look at some of the curvilinear relationship that may not match some of the relationships that exist in Western firms. So I don't want, this is not a presentation about political risk, but what we could see is that in fact, focusing on just one example of political risk, that when we start looking at the data more closely, we see that the relationships can be, they're not robust, and in fact are changed depending on the source of the data. And that is a problem specifically for Chinese papers using MOFCOM data. Another issue is the operational difficulties due to inexperience. For example, Carl Savant, in his papers on Chinese investment, found that the Chinese don't have a good understanding of the power corridors in Washington, D.C., or in understanding the importance of transparency, or even in understanding how to deal with institutional and cultural differences. And this has led to failed acquisitions in the United States, in Europe and Canada, and to failure to integrate firms as well as they might be able to. Of course, one can argue that Chinese firms are learning and will continue to learn, and therefore will develop many of these capabilities that they're currently missing. And the dynamic capability approach might be able to shed some light on how they might evolve over the years. And then I guess as a final point, we have actually published a paper in the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs in which we examined the widespread concern that maybe the Chinese investment is not as beneficial as perhaps other investments coming from a different regime with different set of goals and interests. Is this investment overall positive or not to the foreign countries and the foreign acquisition targets? And this is a paper where we have tried to outline the pros and cons and the different approaches to understanding it from a societal, legal, and economic perspective. So this kind of brings me to the end of my talk. I think I'll be able to take some questions now. I've shown you why the Chinese investment is important. What are the different approaches to studying and the different theories to studying the Chinese investment abroad? And what are 5 different areas that might be worth examining in more detail?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Alon. I appreciate it. It was wonderful. We do have some questions. This webinar is being broadcast to our attendees and also in different Facebook and YouTube. So some of the questions here that I would like to read to you. And remember, please note that these questions came as you speak. So you may have already answered some of them, but if you want to, okay. One question is, how will the One Belt, One Road strategy affect the world economy, in your opinion?
This is a great question. And in fact, it's a question that we are now writing a book about, editing a book by Palgrave. The book should be out in 2018. And the focus is on the One Belt, One Road, which will affect probably more than 100 countries at the end as it's being expanded, both through land and through water routes. And it is a way for China to develop a new globalization architecture, one that will rival the current systems and institutions. And really, the jury is still out. What we do know is that many of the current initiatives under the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, many of these initiatives, in fact, are initiatives that China has had for a while already. And the One Belt, One Road has given it a structure to package all these various initiatives into a kind of a framework. And indeed, it's a fascinating framework. But what we don't know is whether, in fact, this is a resource acquisition framework, if it is a foreign aid framework, if it's a trade promotion, investment promotion, or just a geopolitical repositioning of China. And that is yet to be seen. We are following it closely. And in fact, next year, Chinese Globalization Association China Goes Global Conference in Shanghai will deal with this issue as a focal point.
Wonderful. Thank you. And the other question is, okay. So there are several questions, but I will read the first one. What are the biggest challenges, in your opinion, when China goes global?
To whom, right? There are different challenges to the firm, both the buying firm, perhaps the target firm. There are different challenges for the industries involved. There are different challenges for the home country market, and there's different challenges for the host country market. And there might even be challenges to the relationships between China and the host market. So I think we need to hone in this question in order to fully develop the answer.
Okay. Perfect. So I'm going to...
So if this person wants to send another question,
sure,
and let me know specifically what they're referring to, then I might be able to give them.
Okay. We will wait for that. And then, but I have another question for you from another attendee. With the upcoming elections in October, presenting so many questions and potential for subtle clues into the party's direction, what will be the major indicator for you about China's direction?
Well, it's hard to tell. You know, the Trump administration has appointed people who are both for and against China into their administration, in a way, pitting the good versus the bad cop, and being able to play a kind of a mediating role. I think that one thing that is interesting, I assume we're talking about the U.S. elections, U.S. politics. But one of the interesting things that we see is that both the extreme right and the extreme left agree on one thing, and that is to prevent China from taking a greater role both in U.S. economics and politics, but also probably in the geopolitical context as well. And it's the moderates, the people in the middle, who believe in free trade, who believe in the role of business in promoting peace and harmony in the world. Probably those are the forces that will be more pro-China, more status quo.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question here, Professor Alon, is how is China's emergence as the largest market for technologically advanced products, electronic cars, for example, while the current political leadership in the U.S. de-emphasizes environmental regulations affecting multinational companies?
So I think that China will become a leader in many of the emerging industries, even in the area of sustainability. We just heard that China will ban gas cars soon from being sold throughout China. A move that was taken only by select countries at the moment. The UK was the first to announce it. In addition, in solar panel technologies, China is going to probably lead the way. And I think part of it is necessity. You know, the environment in China is very polluted, and you can't get away from it. So the move of focusing on renewable energy and focusing on these technologies. Take, for example, computer technologies. You know, Ma Yun or Jack Ma of Alibaba once said in an interview that for Americans, technology is a dessert, and for Chinese, technology is a main course. So clearly, the reorganization of society on the back of companies like WeChat, Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, and others are clearly going to change the playing of these companies in the global arena.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question just came in. There's a camp of educators who ignore China, and there's others who don't. What do you suggest for the educators in US in terms of coverage of China in their curriculum?
Yeah, I don't think anybody ignores China. I don't think you can ignore China.
Not just US, maybe the world, I would say, even Norway or Europe.
I don't think, even in Norway, okay, Norway has had, you know, difficult relations with China because of the Nobel Prize awardee who was in jail in China. And even in Norway, where apparently a country that survives on resources, many of these resources needed within Europe, the desire to harmonize relationships with China was very strong on the political front. So I don't think anyone can discount or ignore China, whether you are in Norway or in America or in other countries. I just visited Italy, and some of my colleagues were telling me that Chinese tourists now are probably the biggest group of tourists in Italy. So Chinese people, companies, capital is essential now to the world, and it's and if you ignore it, then you won't be part of this growth. You live in Florida, by the way. In Florida, many of the luxury homes sold are now targeting Chinese investors, and there is a bunch of people in China, Westerners, who are trying to convince Chinese investors to invest for citizenship, both in the United States and Europe.
EB-5 program, yeah, you're right. There's quite a bit investment going on by Chinese. Luxury spending is happening in different parts of America, obviously including in Florida. But you're right also too, there's EB-5 program, which is $800,000 investment by anybody, not just Chinese, but if they create 10 jobs, they get the citizenship. So that's very popular among Chinese.
How can you ignore 1.3 billion people? How can you ignore the second largest economy in the world? How can you ignore the second largest flows of capital in the world? How can you ignore the one country that is investing more in R&D than almost any other country in the world? I mean, China is going to reshape both the geopolitical shape of the world right now and the economic and even cultural eventually. You'll see more Chinese movies, you'll hear more Chinese music, and more of our youth will be speaking Chinese as a second language.
Exactly. That is a little bit challenging for at least for me. Chinese is very difficult to learn as opposed to English. I'm a second, English is my second language, but I wish Chinese was a little bit easier, so that would have been easier for me or for many people to learn. Here's another question. I think you already answered this, but I'm gonna just make sure that I read the question what theories does Professor Alon shall use to explain the outward direct investment made by Chinese firms?
Yeah, at the moment, theories is not gospel. Let's start with this, right? Theories are meant to be challenged and to test it. And at the moment, I feel that we need to go beyond the bread and butter institutional theory and resource-based theory that we use. And at the moment, I'm working with Xiaomin Li on a governance theory, for example, of establishment modes. So we're looking at exactly why Chinese investors who buy firms, why would they choose to buy as opposed to do it themselves? Why would they choose greenfield versus an acquisition? And I think there is a need and there is an opportunity to develop new theory. Because many of our existing theories, assumptions are wrong. So we need to go beyond and to develop theories that are more generalizable to different contexts. Rather than saying China is different and nothing works, or saying, well, whatever we have in existence is sufficient, so we don't need to do anything else. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm just scanning the Facebook and the other parts. Here's one question. How does the changes in the global operating environment, for example, political, economic, influence the demand for tourism in China, in your opinion?
I think China is, I think at the moment, still lets its own citizens decide where to go. But to the extent that some countries are unfriendly to the Chinese, if we see a violent reaction to Chinese ethnic populations, I mean, clearly that's not good for tourism. But the Chinese, they basically want to see the same places we in the West like to see, right? They like to see Paris and Venice and exotic places in Southeast Asia as well. I mean, so many of them are flocking to Europe. Many of them are flocking to the United States and Southeast Asia as well.
I'm just curious, Professor Alon, why did you choose China as a field of study, but not, let's say, Israel or any other country for that matter?
Okay, so actually, to some extent, China chose me. In 1998, when I finished my PhD, I got an invitation from China, and I was simply fascinated with the language, with the culture, and with what I saw in the economic environment and the industrial development. So I kept coming back and studying the language, the culture, and the economy, and publishing papers. And the deeper I got, the more interesting it became.
Wonderful. That's great. This concludes our questions. I do appreciate your time, Professor Alon. I also would like to show our attendees one more time the website where this particular video recording, and also there's one question there, which I will go there in a second. And also, people are saying thank you to you. This video lecture, and also Professor Alon gave us a link to the presentation that he used. So we are going to post that as well. So the attendees are saying thank you very much, very interesting and useful.
So you can all link to me on LinkedIn, and I posted the PowerPoint there as well, and I'm always interested to sharing ideas, blogging on China. There are several things I've written on it for popular press as well as academic articles.
Yes, exactly. I'm going to email to everybody who attended, and I will also make it available, that LinkedIn page, in the presentation that we have here. And with that one, I would like to thank, let me just stop the share. So bring Professor Alon here again. Professor Alon, thank you so much for doing this wonderful webinar, opening a lot of great research insights for the attendees. Please note that this is going to be available recording. A lot of you will be probably watching this offline, and feel free to reach to Professor Alon if you have any questions. For those of you who are interested in becoming a distinguished lecturer, please let us know. we will be happy to have you, just like we are very happy to have Dr. Alon here. Dr. Alon, thank you for your time, and hope to see you in face-to-face in China Goes Global or any other, maybe ANAHEI conferences or your conference very soon in the future.
Wonderful. Take care.
Thanks all of you to attending. Have a wonderful day, night, evening. We'll hope to see you in the next Distinguished Lecture Series by ANAHEI. Bye-bye.